that Shanghai was, in many ways, a surrealist city, and that science fiction, which had close affinities with surrealism, was a way in which I could use the techniques of surrealism to remake the landscape of 1950s and 1960s England into something that, in a way, resembled the Shanghai I'd left behind.
The landscapes you invent seem to me to be very powerful and very imaginative indeed. But there's a simplicity, in a way, some have suggested, about the human relationships in your writing and in your sort of writing, really. Is that something that one loses if one abandons the naturalistic tradition of novel writing, loses the complexity of human relationships?
I think that's true, because I think the imaginative writer, and to some extent the science fiction writer, and we see this in the greatest science fiction writers like Orwell and Huxley in Brave New World and Wells, isn't concerned with characterization. He's concerned, I mean, I feel this about myself, I'm much more concerned with psychological roles. The people who appear in my fiction have an affinity with the sort of people you find in case histories. You know, I mean, Mrs. F got onto a train in Guildford and found she was sitting in the carriage next to God, and God told her to go out and sweep the streets of Guildford. The following day she bought a broom. This is a case history. Now, what is important is this psychological phenomenon of this woman, not, what her tastes in petit fours are, or what all her little relationships with her cousins and her aunts.
Right. What feeds your imagination now? What do you read?
I'm afraid mostly non-fiction.
What sort of non-fiction?
Well, by coincidence, I've just finished Peter Gay's biography of Freud, a remarkable work. I'm now reading another biography of Lotte Lenya, and a book by the chief stylist of Mercedes-Benz on the psychology of automobile design. So I'm a bit of a magpie, but I think pretty well everything is grist to my mill.
Do you get information from printouts and
Yes.
journals and do you read railway timetables?
Not as many, sadly, as I used to. An old friend of mine, Dr. Christopher Evans at the National Physical Laboratory, until his death, literally sent me every week the contents of his waste paper basket, which I devoured. It was full of pharmaceutical company handouts, specialist journals, extraordinary material, which most science fiction writers, never have access to. And access is a big problem. One just isn't. There's this paradox of a world in which modern communications have triumphed. I mean, data move around the globe at the speed of an electron, and yet one has access to less and less.
I've known writers who complained to me that we would all be swamped under great piles of paper information. You seem to rather welcome the prospect and wish there was no limit to what you could know.
Yes, I do. I mean, I'd love to know everything that I could. I would like to have the equivalent of a ticker tape. I dare say one day this will happen. Spilling out information of every kind, the latest automobile varnishes, what everybody the 747 on the way to Miami had for breakfast, the program of the Royal Opera House for the next 10 years, everything, because this stimulates the imagination, and
it's an age of information. Is it an age of space? Is it a space age? Are we living in a space age?
Sadly, I think the space age has ended.
Why do you think that?
Well, I remember hearing in 1957 the BBC broadcast of the call sign of Sputnik 1, which was a real call to arms. I mean, it was a signal from another world. This was the future dialing itself into us. And everyone then expected, particularly when Gagarin went into space and later when the Americans landed on the moon in 1969, that the space age would run on forever. But in fact, I don't think it happened. I think public interest soon after began to wane, and I think far from lasting hundreds of years, the space age ran for less than 20, from 1957, Sputnik 1, to 1975, which was the first Apollo splashdown not to be shown on TV by the American networks because they knew the public was bored. And what even more surprising, which startled me, was that it produced no spin-off. I can remember the 1930s when all the great record-breaking attempts, the fastest plane, the fastest train, the deepest descent into the oceans, the highest balloon, all these had a tremendous, gave a tremendous charge to ordinary life. I mean, the spin-off in architecture and design of domestic interiors, I mean, everything was streamlined. Even static objects like teapots were streamlined. Now, none of that happened as a consequence of the American space and Russian space programs.
Yeah, maybe another race to Mars will start it up again. What about inner space? It sounds from what you're saying as if you think that one has a long way to go.
Yes, I think so. I think that's rather a larger area and far more complicated. And is after all, where I mean, it's the inside of our heads which shape our sense of ourselves and the universe. And it's an interior that we can map every square inch of the moon or Mars, and no doubt will do, but the inside of our heads is a very different proposition.
It's the role of your fiction to invent. Can you go on and on inventing in the extraordinary way that you do?
I haven't.
Does switching into, as you did with Empire of the Sun, into a sort of more autobiographical novel, did that provide a bit of respite?
Curiously enough.
Or was that invented too?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it's semi-autobiographical, and by and large the picture that I describe is as accurate as I remember it, though I reshaped individual incidents, of course. But the general picture of Shanghai in the war is as I remember it, and is borne out by newsreels at the time. That was a realistic novel, but of a very heightened kind.
Yes.
And
will there be more?
I feel, will I follow that up? Yes, I'm working now on, I think my next book will be a follow-up to Empire of the Sun, tracing what happened when I returned to England.
Can you go on inventing more other worlds beyond that, do you think?
It's not a matter of inventing a completely self-contained world, because most of my novels of, say, the 70s, Crash, High Rise, which about high-rise buildings, Concrete Island, about a man marooned on a traffic island, are all set in the here and now.
Right.
They're not, strictly speaking, they're not science fiction at all, really. But they look at the opportunities that modern technology offers for us to play games with our own sort of psychopathologies. What I do is enlist the imagination and try to place it at the service of what I see as, the half-visible that lies, that area that lies in the back of our heads that needs to be lit up. I don't think invention plays as big a part, really, in my fiction as it appears to at first sight.